Research for this video is drafted from the text Constitutional Odyssey, which in the tradition of university textbooks has now had its fourth publishing, in which they added a single white page. The first version of the Canadian Constitution was written in 1867. This was the British North America Acts, which signed as an act of British Parliament. This would grant the creation of Canada, with legislative body that represents 4 provinces. This first constitution was organic in that it was implicit throughout the laws of Canada and was not a subset of specific rules that had to be obeyed. The American Constitution was something the world was shunning. Unalienable rights was a bit of a chaos because how could you legislate anything of importance if one is protecting the right to bear arms or the right to protect freedom of speech? Canada's first effort to build a constitution was written in the laws and was hence a parliamentary constitution and not one of the people. This was fitting because Canada itself never consented to becoming a nation. When America was formed, it was a few colonies coming together and signing a declaration together that they would form a country. Anyone who opposed the creation of the United States of America moved to Canada. With Canada, anyone who opposed Confederation was still within Canada, and the Act was signed by a British monarch with specific restraint and control implied. The first agreement was a compromise between American loyalists who really feared the United States and immigrants who wanted to be able to handle their own international policy. There are the 2 competing philosophies of John Locke and Edmund Burke. Locke wanted a constitution like the United States. It was to be filled with individual rights and limitations of government. It was a document designed to protect the citizens from its own government. It was a document that was difficult to change and would have values that represent any new entrance into society. Burke saw a constitution as being implicit in laws and changing based on the times. Burke was a conservative, but he saw the need for slow evolution and slow progression. While the American Constitution wouldn't change for 300 years, the Canadian one will be updated based on needs. Why, for example, should the anti-Chinese sentiments of the 19th century still hold today? After the King Byng affair, Canada gained the ability to make its own laws without the consent of England. It was the first time that Canada was its own country. But Canada's constitution was still in England. None of the provinces could agree exactly what Canada's constitution should be. Quebec and Alberta favored having minimalist constitution that would allow each province to run independently with the option to create its own Bill of Rights. Ontario and the Maritimes preferred a constitution that could be used to prosecute poor behavior in other provinces. And because of this disagreement, Canada wouldn't get its own constitution. The default result to speed up the process was to keep the constitution in England as an act of British Parliament. This was until the 70s. A new player was in town. His name was Pierre Elliot Trudeau. This guy was smoking hot. Literally. This is a picture of him and Sex and the City star Kim Cattrall, just one of his many lovers. At one point, he ordered Canada on military rule, and when asked if he'd wiretap regular Canadians, he answered, "Just watch me." He swore in Parliament and called it fuddle-duddle. Despite all this, he is one of Canada's longest running prime ministers. No prime minister has had as many interprovincial meetings as Trudeau. Trudeau sat down with all the provinces, crafted one of the most ambitious documents in the world. It would set down in law how Canada's laws were crafted, specific rights for individual citizens, powers granted to the provinces and federal governments, and most importantly, transfer payments. Before the Constitution, transfer payments were varying in value and would pay the poorest provinces, known as have-nots, a disproportionate amount of money, while provinces that were doing well, known as haves, would get nothing. This was an important bargaining chip, as the Supreme Court of Canada ruled that this document was to leave British Parliament, it would need to be accepted by the Parliament, Senate, and a plurality of provinces representing over half of the country's population. Every single province but Quebec agreed with the change. In 1982, the Queen of England patriated the Constitution back to Canada in an historic signing. The new Constitution also included a new amendment, the Charter of Rights and Freedoms. The Charter was based off the 1960 Canadian Bill of Rights, with a few additions. It was attached to the front. More importantly, though, was the formula for changing the Constitution. The formula would require parliamentary approval and support of at least 7 provinces representing at least half of Canada's population. The initial approval saw every province ratify the document except for one, Quebec. The implications of this act were far-reaching. Here is a document in which Quebec gets all the benefits of a legal part of Canada, but can avoid all the responsibilities of it. The Constitution gave the division of powers between provinces and federal government, but Quebec had no respect for this division. Quebec would establish its own Charter of Rights and Freedoms, the Civil Codes of Quebec. Quebec would establish its own immigration board, allowing it to refuse immigrants and refugees that do not speak French. Quebec also had its own legal system, with laws that supersede the Supreme Court of Canada, the Quebec Civil Court. The document was by no means the supreme document that the United States had. It didn't apply to everyone equally and could be overridden. Section 33 of the Charter included what is known as the Notwithstanding Clause. This allowed the government to overrule Supreme Court decisions and allow them to legislate on constitutional laws. What's important is that the Constitution was still a compromise between the values of John Locke and those of Edmund Burke. The Charter had no shortage of critics. Although everyone voted to get it across the pond, everyone wanted to change it. Quebec wanted recognition as a unique province with unique rules to protect its culture and language. Western Canadians wanted to have an elected Senate. Eastern Canadians wanted to abolish it. People had problems with first-past-the-post voting, veto rights, Aboriginal self-government, judicial appointments, provincial-federal power split, and fixed election dates. As far as the document goes, it made no one happy, and everyone felt like it should be changed. However, the new amending formula made it very difficult to make any changes at all. Pierre Elliot Trudeau stepped down and was replaced by John Turner, who was also a beautiful man. However, Brian Mulroney was around and was riding on the winds of change, progressive conservative change. Mulroney was an ardent anti-Trudeau guy with personal friends in Ronald Reagan and Margaret Thatcher. Mulroney set up a conference at Meech Lake in order to discuss and agree to amendments to the Constitution. The biggest issue was to get Quebec to sign the document. Quebec had a laundry list of complaints. Quebec wanted recognition as unique, a constitutional veto, input into appointment of Quebec Supreme Judges, a limit to federal taxing power, and Quebec would get veto power on immigrants to the province. After a 9-hour session, Mulroney and all the provinces agreed to these terms. These would become widespread provincial powers. All new Supreme Court judges would be drawn from representatives of provinces and would be based on a list of candidates provided by the provinces. The country was shocked by how fast and easy this was. Opposition parties, upon seeing the agreement, joined in bipartisan support for these light reforms. But it wouldn't be that easy. Pierre Elliot Trudeau, once a shining example, had become but a snake and an obstructionist. He penned an article that reached a large number of papers, criticizing the accord as being weak, and destroyed the Canadian identity as being one Canada. Years later, Mulroney would blame the failure of the Meech Lake Accord on Trudeau and Jean Chrétien. He said, "The Meech Lake Accord had been obstructed and undermined by people who thought they had the right to govern forever." Trudeau and Chrétien lobbied the provinces to reject the deal. Liberal Newfoundland Premier Clyde Wells was a former employee of Chrétien's, and when the time came, Wells refused to allow the bill to be debated in their local legislature. On Wells, Mulroney said, "If Lord Jesus himself had come down to earth and asked Clyde to support the Meech Lake thing, Clyde would not have supported it. He had his mind made up, and when Clyde decided and made his mind up, that was it." The Acts of Newfoundland sent ripples across Canada and sowed doubt. It was no stronger than in Manitoba, which had a minority government. Aboriginal MLAs were filibustering the accord and not letting it go to a vote. As time passed, a vote went through in Manitoba, and without respect for Aboriginal self-government, it failed. With that vote, Newfoundland maintained that there was still no point in even putting it up to a vote because it had failed in Manitoba. The other 8 provinces saw this as interventions by Trudeau and Chrétien and refused to negotiate another deal. Newfoundland and Manitoba wanted amendments and would not vote in favor of it without amendments. This would lead to a Charlottetown Accord. The ministers would meet again, but this time they would also invite Aboriginal leaders. The new document made more radical changes. The new document promised for elected senators or appointed senators from the provincial legislature, depending on the province's choice. A new social clause gave required federal transfers for health care, education, environment, and welfare. Aboriginals would gain new self-government and would gain similar statuses to the provinces. Alberta, British Columbia, and Quebec had since made reforms indicating that any constitutional amendments would require consent of the people from a referendum. A nationwide referendum was held. This would fit the technical standard of Canada's constitution. All the premiers were in favor, but many had minority governments. The Parliament was in favor. All they needed was 50% support from the Canadian population. Campaigning in favor of it was a coalition of PCs, Liberals, NDP, premiers, Aboriginal groups, women's groups, business leaders. The amendment had its opposition, though. The most important of these was Trudeau.
They think they're as good as anywhere. Who needs special powers? The politicians. They're the ones who want special powers naturally, because they're in the power game. And what they can get from Ottawa, they will have more in Charlottetown, in Quebec City, in Victoria, BC.
He was back again. He penned a letter and made many interviews, calling this deal a sellout of Canadian values, referring to it as the disintegration of the federal government. A new ragtag party had formed in the West called the Reform Party. The Reform Party was growing in popularity in Alberta, Saskatchewan, and Manitoba, and was led by Preston Manning, son of Ernest Manning, the longest-serving premier in Canadian history. Manning opposed the recognition of Quebec as a unique society and felt that this deal would give Quebec too much power. Manning saw this document as simply solidifying Ontario and Quebec as a power center of the country while leaving the growing western provinces in the dark. Finally, a Quebec party called the Bloc Québécois and its provincial branch, the Parti Québécois, both opposed this because they believed it did not give Quebec enough power. Because it was a referendum, this was also regarded as a referendum on Mulroney himself, who was becoming less and less popular. When speaking, he referred to the no voters as the enemies of Canada. When it came time for the referendum, it had failed. Only 45% of Canadians said yes or oui to the accord. The accord was simply too ambitious and had too many details. Literally everyone could find at least one thing they could disagree with, even if the deal as a whole was better for every individual group involved. Mulroney would step down, and a few months later, PCs would be replaced by the Liberals. The issue of Canada's Constitution is still one that is living and breathing in today's society. Most of the issues that were left unresolved by its failures are still things that we are grappling with today. Just after the document failed, the Bloc Québécois stated that they are elected into government, they would be its own country. But that's a story for another time.
Regardless of what happens, we're going to have disputes in this country. I think we all agree with that. I'm also of the opinion that if on the 23rd of June, 1990, Manitoba and Newfoundland had ratified the Meech Lake Accord, I'm not one to say that we would not have constitutional problems today. We would have. But the constitutional problems would be nothing as compared to what we do have today. I think the Meech Lake Accord would have settled
the issue would be a different level of issue.
That's exactly right,
institutional
Brian.
issue instead of a founding people issue, which gets so fundamental and a motive.